It is a Friday afternoon in July at Grossinger's, the crown jewel of the Borscht Belt, one of the summers in the middle of the last century when the resort is at its full height. This is the story of a world that lasted about 128 years, and that most people only know because of a movie. The outdoor pool is Olympic-sized. The grounds around it run for 1,200 acres and 35 buildings, here in the Catskill Mountains of New York, past a 9-hole golf course, past the ski slope with the artificial snow machines the hotel installed in 1952, the first ever installed in the world, past a private airstrip and a post office where the postmark reads Grossinger, New York. A man works the pool whose job is to wake up the guests when they fall asleep in the sun. He is called a tummler. Mel Brooks used to do this job here, in a derby and an alpaca coat, carrying 2 suitcases loaded with rocks to the edge of the diving board, calling out that business is no good. Inside the main building, the dining room is set for 1,300. Beneath the dining room is the terrace room, the nightclub, designed by the architect Morris Lapidus, where the comedians who will fill American television for the next 30 years are getting ready to work. Milton Berle, Jerry Lewis, Alan King, Joan Rivers. Down the road at the Concord, 3,000 people will sit down to dinner in a hall the size of a football field, and a young Barbra Streisand will play the Imperial Room for $500, because that is what the William Morris Agency says she is worth this week. Down the road the other direction at Kutsher's, a bellhop is carrying luggage into second-floor rooms by lifting the bags into the windows from where he stands on the ground outside, because he is 7 feet, 1 inch tall. In the evening, the resort's athletic director, a man named Red Auerbach, will coach him in a pickup game on the outdoor court. His name is Wilt Chamberlain. He is 17 years old. 150,000 people come through Grossinger's in a single year. 500 hotels dot the mountains around it. 50,000 bungalows, 1,000 rooming houses. Something close to 1 million Jewish New Yorkers arrive here every summer, driving up Route 17 out of a city where the summer heat has not yet been broken by an air conditioner in every window. It is called the Borscht Belt. Within 20 years, most of it will be gone. The story begins with a man who could not make a living. Asher Selig Grossinger arrived in New York from the village of Balagrad in 1897. Balagrad was then part of Galicia, a district of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the Old Country, he had been an estate overseer. In New York, he was a pants presser on the Lower East Side. When he had saved enough, he sent for his wife Malka and his daughters Jenny and Lottie. He tried a butcher shop. It failed. He tried a restaurant. That failed too. By 1914, his health was giving out, and the family needed to leave the city. They bought a farm in Ferndale, New York, in Sullivan County, about 100 miles northwest of Manhattan, in the southern foothills of the Catskill Mountains. It was not much of a farm. The soil in that part of the Catskills is rocky, and rocky in a way that resists crops. The house that came with the land was ramshackle enough that Malka and Jenny had to patch it themselves. That summer, they took in their first paying guest, a Mrs. Carolyn Brown from the Bronx. Jenny Grossinger was 22. She had left school in the 4th grade to sew buttons in the garment industry for $2 a week. She had married her cousin Harry Grossinger in 1912. She had no plan to run a hotel. There was no hotel yet to run. There was a farm that could not be farmed, a house that leaked, and a Bronx woman who wanted a room where the food was kosher and the air was cool. That was the whole beginning. To understand why Mrs. Brown wanted that room, you have to understand what New York was in the summer of 1914. The Lower East Side, where the Grossingers had lived, held 500 people per acre, denser than modern Calcutta. There was no air conditioning yet. Nothing that could push cool air into a tenement. Tuberculosis moved through those buildings the way summer heat moved through the streets outside. Doctors of the era prescribed country air the way they now prescribe medication. If you had the money, you went to the mountains. If you were Jewish, most of the places in the mountains would not let you in. The advertisements were explicit. No Hebrews or consumptives, they said. This is the phrase you find in the historical record. It is not a paraphrase. It is what the hotels of the era wrote in their own promotional copy. So the Jewish families of New York created their own places. Farms that could not grow crops became boarding houses. Boarding houses became kukelanes, a Yiddish word, pronounced kukulein, meaning cook it yourself, a house with a shared kitchen where several families rented rooms and made their own meals. Kuchelanes became bungalow colonies. Bungalow colonies became hotels. Hotels became resorts. The mountains across Sullivan and Ulster and Orange counties filled up with them. The editor of Variety magazine, a man named Abel Green, gave the region its name in 1933. He called it the Borscht Belt, after the Eastern European beet soup the guests ate. He was making a play on Bible Belt and Rust Belt. The name stuck. The commentator Larry King preferred the Yiddish Alps. Locals sometimes called it Solomon County, a malapropism of Sullivan County. Insiders just called it the mountains. At its height, the mountains contained 500 hotels, 50,000 bungalows, and 1,000 rooming houses. The 1953 New York Times reported 538 hotels in Sullivan County alone. Most of them are gone now. But before they were gone, they built something that had never existed anywhere else. By 1919, the Grossingers had outgrown their first house. They sold it and bought a 100-acre property nearby, calling it Grossinger's Terrace Hill House. In 1929, they hired a promoter named Milton Blackstone. He came up with the slogan the hotel would carry for the next 60 years. Grossinger's has everything. By the 1940s, everything meant something specific. The property covered 1,200 acres and 35 buildings. Indoor and outdoor Olympic-sized swimming pools, a ski slope, a summer ice rink, tennis, indoor and outdoor, a golf course, a dining room that seated 1,300, a nightclub beneath the dining room, called the Terrace Room, renovated in 1949 by the architect Morris Lapidus, the same man who would later design the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, a bar called the Pink Elephant, its own airstrip, its own post office. The postmark read Grossinger, New York, and it was not a metaphor. The family at one point reportedly offered $1 million to rename the Ferndale railway station Grossinger's. Competing hoteliers blocked the deal. The resort brought in 150,000 guests a year. A 1954 review in Commentary magazine put it this way. Grossinger's, the reviewer said, was to resort hotels what Bergdorf Goodman was to department stores, what Cadillac was to cars, what Mink was to furs, and what Tiffany was to jewelers. The press called it the Waldorf of the Catskills. Everyone else just called it the G. 10 miles away, in Kiamesha Lake, a different kind of empire was rising. A Russian immigrant named Arthur Winerick had come to America in 1911 and set up as a barber on the Lower East Side. In the bathtub of his apartment, he mixed a bright green hair tonic he called Jerris. It sold. It sold well enough to make him rich. In 1935, he took over a struggling place near the lake called the Ideal House in settlement of a debt. He renamed it the Concord Plaza. It opened with 500 beds. By the 1950s, the Concord was the biggest resort in the Belt. 1,500 guest rooms, 2,000 acres. A dining room that seated 3,000, described in the record as football field-sized. A theater called the Imperial Room, designed by Morris Lapidus, who had done Grossinger's Terrace Room and would go on to define the look of Miami Beach, that seated another 3,000 in a nearly circular hall. A golf course called the Monster. The Concord had a permanent talent booker named Phil Greenwald, a cousin of Winerick's original barbershop partner. His only job was to bring the biggest names in American entertainment to Kiamesha Lake. He got them. Down the road in Monticello, 2 Polish immigrant brothers named Max and Louis Kutsher had opened Kutsher's Brothers Farmhouse in 1907. Their nephew Milton took it over in the 1940s. At its peak, Kutsher's covered 1,500 acres and 400 rooms, with a nightclub called the Stardust. It would survive the longest of any of them. In Ellenville, a man named Charles Slutsky had opened the Nevele in 1901. Nevele is 11, spelled backwards, either after the 11 school teachers who had discovered a waterfall on the property, or after the 11 children Slutsky himself had between 1880 and 1906, depending on which version of the family lore you trust. The Nevele would eventually grow into a 10-story tower with 430 rooms. There were others too. Down in the Delaware Water Gap corridor, Tamiment Resort drew a different crowd, labor union members and left-leaning intellectuals, but it ran on the same Catskills model, all-inclusive, entertainment every night, food that never stopped coming, 500 hotels, 50,000 bungalows, all of them running on the same model at different scales. Kosher food, 3 meals a day plus snacks, entertainment every night, childcare during the day, sports and activities morning to evening, and a single weekly rate that covered all of it. The Borscht Belt invented the all-inclusive family resort. Every Club Med, every Disney resort, every cruise ship that has come after it is running the same idea. Almost none of it exists anymore, but it was very hard to see that coming, sitting by the pool at Grossinger's on a Friday afternoon in the middle of the century. The peak years were the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, and the peak had a specific shape. Comedy came first. As vaudeville faded in the 1930s, the comedians who had worked its circuits needed somewhere new to perform, and the growing Catskill resorts needed somewhere for their guests to sit after dinner. The two needs met. A generation of comedians made itself in the Borscht Belt before television found them. Milton Berle, Sid Caesar, Jack Benny, born Benjamin Kubelski, George Burns, born Nathan Birnbaum, Danny Kaye, born David Daniel Kaminsky, Eddie Cantor, born Edward Israel Iskowitz, Jerry Lewis, Joan Rivers, Rodney Dangerfield, Henny Youngman, whose Take My Wife, Please became one of the most quoted lines in American comedy. Don Rickles, Buddy Hackett, Jackie Mason, Alan King, Shecky Green, Red Buttons, Toady Fields, Woody Allen, Mel Brooks, born Melvin Kaminsky in Brooklyn, who described the tummler's job as waking up the Jews when they fell asleep around the pool. The next generation trained on the same stages. Billy Crystal, Jerry Seinfeld, Andy Kaufman, B. Arthur, Jerry Stiller. Music came in behind the comedy. Duke Ellington played the belt. Louis Armstrong played the belt. Tony Bennett was a regular at the Concord's Imperial Room. So was Milton Berle. Judy Garland played the Concord. So did Aretha Franklin, Diana Ross, and Sammy Davis Jr. A young Barbra Streisand played the Concord before Funny Girl, booked, according to the record, for $500 because that is what her agency thought she was worth that week. And then there was the food. The historian Jonathan Sarna, one of the leading scholars of American Jewish history, once wrote that to understand the emphasis on food at these hotels, you had to understand hunger. The immigrants who came here had memories of hunger. In the Catskills, the food seemed limitless. There was a sense, Sarna wrote, that too much was not enough. Then the athletes came. The Catskills became, for about 2 decades, a training camp for professional boxing. Rocky Marciano trained at Grossinger's. The corrugated metal building where he worked out was known as Marciano's office. In 1954, he prepared there for a title fight with Ezzard Charles. Charles trained at Kutsher's, 10 miles away. That summer, Edward R. Murrow interviewed both boxers on a single split-screen television broadcast, one from each hotel. Muhammad Ali trained at Kutsher's. So did Floyd Patterson and Leon Spinks. Jimmy Braddock had trained at Hotel Evans in Loch Sheldrake back in 1935 for his championship fight with Max Baer. Max Schmeling spent 6 weeks in the Catskills in 1936 preparing to fight Joe Louis. And basketball. In the summer of 1954, before his senior year of high school, a 17-year-old took a job as a bellhop at Kutsher's Country Club. He was 7 feet, 1 inch tall. He earned $2 an hour. When guests checked in, he would carry their luggage to their rooms by lifting the bags into second-floor windows while standing on the ground outside. In the evenings, he played on the Kutsher's basketball team, coached by the resort's athletic director, Red Auerbach. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. 5 years later, in August 1959, Milton Kutsher and an NBA player named Jack Twyman started an annual charity all-star game at the hotel for Twyman's teammate Maurice Stokes, who had been paralyzed by a brain injury a year earlier and had no income because the NBA had no pension plan yet. The Maurice Stokes benefit game ran for decades. Bill Russell played it, Bob Cousy played it, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played it, Julius Erving played it, Oscar Robertson, Pete Maravich, Billy Cunningham. It rivaled the actual NBA All-Star Game in talent. The politicians came too. Eleanor Roosevelt was a personal friend of Jenny Grossinger. So was Nelson Rockefeller. So was Cardinal Francis Joseph Spellman. President Lyndon Johnson stayed at the Nevele in 1966. Robert Kennedy was a Grossinger's guest. So were Chaim Weizmann, the future president of Israel, and the Nobel laureates Selman Waksman and Arthur Kornberg. Then there were the ceremonies. In September 1955, a young singer named Eddie Fisher married a young actress named Debbie Reynolds at Grossinger's, in front of photographers from every major newspaper in the country. Fisher had been discovered at the resort a few years earlier. He would later return with his second wife, Elizabeth Taylor. And in March 1968, at the Concord Hotel in Kiamisha Lake, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the keynote speech at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention. He was assassinated 10 days later. 2 other facts belong in this chapter. In March 1952, Grossinger's became the first place on Earth to make artificial snow to ski on. Every snowmaking machine that has ever been fired up on a mountain, anywhere in the world, is running an idea that was tested first at a Jewish family resort in Liberty, New York. And in 1959, at a hotel called the Shawanga Lodge in the town of Bloomingburg, a group of scientists held the conference that launched serious American research into laser beams. The mountains were producing the 20th century. The Sullivan County historian John Conway has a phrase for what came next. He calls them the 3 A's: air conditioning, assimilation, airfare. Any one of them would have hurt the Borscht Belt. All 3 of them together took it apart. Air conditioning came first. The Catskills existed in the first place because a New York summer was unbearable and the mountains were cool. By the late 1950s, window units were becoming cheap enough for ordinary apartments. The medical reason for the trip was disappearing. Airfare came second. In October 1958, Pan American began commercial jet service on the Boeing 707. Within a few years, a middle-class family in Queens could fly to Miami Beach or San Juan or the Caribbean or Europe for the kind of money that used to buy a week in the mountains. Younger vacationers, in particular, went. The Catskills had been the only reasonable option. Now they were one option among many. Assimilation came third, and it came the hardest. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to run advertisements saying, "No Hebrews or consumptives." The hotels that had once excluded Jews now had to admit them. The whole reason the Borscht Belt had existed as a separate world, a Jewish world in the middle of a country that had kept Jews out, was gone. Intermarriage rates among American Jews rose from about 10% in the 1950s to over 30% by the 1970s. The grandchildren of immigrants did not want to summer where their grandparents had summered. They wanted to fly somewhere else. Then there were the smaller forces. The passenger trains that had brought guests to the mountains were disappearing. The last passenger train on the New York, Ontario, and Western Railway ran from Roscoe to Weehawken on September 10, 1953. That line had once carried up to 150,000 people a year, some days 11,000 at once. The railroad went into liquidation in 1957, and its tracks were pulled up starting in 1959. Women began staying in the workforce after marriage, which meant they could no longer take an entire summer off to relocate a family to a bungalow. And the mid-sized hotels, trying to compete with Grossinger's and the Concord, were bankrupting themselves, adding indoor pools and ski slopes and nightclubs they could not afford. On August 11, 1965, a fire at the Prospect Inn in Parksville killed 5 people. The county tightened its fire codes. Smaller hotels that could not afford to comply began to close. The following Labor Day weekend, the New York Times reporter Homer Bigart drove up to Loch Sheldrake and filed a piece from the empty rooms of a place called the New Roxy. A singular hush, he wrote, betrayed only by the occasional romping of crickets or the stomping of a stray hen on the greensward, had fallen this Labor Day weekend on the Rococo precincts of the New Roxy Hotel. The rancid smell of decaying food filtered down the corridors from the kitchen. His headline read, "Keeping Up with the Grossingers Strains Many Catskills Hotels. It is now considered the industry's obituary." The New Roxy's owners had borrowed over $700,000 trying to keep up. At the time of the sale, they owed their laundry $28,000, their butcher $26,000, and their grocer $11,000. The peak had already ended. Most people just did not know it yet. The decline did not happen all at once. It happened building by building over 40 years, and the sequence is worth walking through, because the shape of it is the shape of an entire industry going down. Jenny Grossinger died on November 20, 1972. She was 80 years old. The resort she had built from a leaking farmhouse in Ferndale, New York, into a 1,200-acre kingdom outlived her by 14 years. In October 1985, her descendants agreed to sell it to a group of investors called Servco for $9 million. The buyers said they would spend another $4 million renovating the 585-room Tudor-style hotel. It did not happen. The main hotel closed in 1986. On the 1st of September that year, Eddie Fisher tried to detonate the Grossinger Playhouse with dynamite as a symbolic beginning to the redevelopment. The charge fizzled. A bulldozer had to finish the job. In December 1989, Grossinger's associates filed for bankruptcy. The Concord held on longer. In January 1997, the New York State Legislature rejected a casino referendum the Concord's owners had been counting on. The next month, the resort filed for bankruptcy. It owed Sullivan County more than $8 million in back taxes. It closed in 1998 after 63 years. In January 1999, it was auctioned off for $10.25 million to a partnership led by a man named Joseph Murphy, with the Westchester developer Louis Capelli as a silent partner. The main hotel came down in 2008. The Pines closed in 1998. Breezy Corners, next door to the Concord, closed in 2008. The Hayden Hotel in South Fallsburg, the one where the 1987 movie Sweet Lorraine had been filmed, burned in May 2008. The Nevele Grand Hotel, which had opened in 1901 as the first of them, closed on July 4, 2009. It owed Ulster County over $700,000 in back taxes, and after closure, another $293,000 in unpaid utilities. Kutsher's held out the longest of all. Its matriarch, Helen Kutsher, died on March 19, 2013. 5 months later, the resort was condemned. It had been open for 106 years. In December, it was sold for $8,180,000 to a company that planned to build a wellness resort on the site. Demolition began the following spring. By the early 1980s, only 5 or 6 of the original 500 hotels remained in operation. By 2013, the last of them was gone. You could have driven up Route 17 in almost any year after 1970 and found new ruins. Shawanga Lodge burned in 1973. The Pines burned in June 2023. Homowack Lodge burned in July 2023. Historians of the region attribute at least 100 hotel fires to failing owners looking for a way out. There is a movie about all this you may have seen. In 1987, a former Grossinger's guest named Eleanor Bergstein wrote a screenplay called Dirty Dancing. The setting is a resort called Kellerman's in the summer of 1963. Kellerman's is Grossinger's. Bergstein spent her childhood summers there. She won the resort's champagne dance contest. The real dance instructor at Grossinger's, from 1954 to 1986, a woman named Jackie Horner, was the inspiration for the character Penny. The movie was released the year after Grossinger's closed. By the time most Americans saw the world of the Catskill resorts on a screen, that world had already ended. Drive Route 17 through Sullivan County today, and this is what you find. Where Grossinger's stood, there is a piece of ground in Liberty, near Ferndale, that has been almost completely cleared. The last of the resort's buildings was demolished on October 19, 2018. A remaining structure burned to the ground on August 16, 2022. The famous golf course they called the Big G closed in 2017. The clubhouse was pulled down the following summer. In June 2025, the 1,100 acres of what used to be Grossinger's were sold, again, to a company called PPG Development. The price was $14,750,000. The company said it planned to build a luxury golf resort and a residential community. The rocky soil that had refused to grow crops in 1914 turned out to be scenic enough, 111 years later, to be worth that much money as a place to hit a ball across. Where the Concord stood, in Kiamesha Lake, there is a casino. It is called Resorts World Catskills. It opened on February 8, 2018, on the demolished ground where Arthur Winarick's Jarris Fortune once built the largest resort in the belt. The build cost was $1.2 billion. It has an 18-story hotel, 100,000 square feet of gaming floor, 1,600 slot machines, and 140 live dealer tables. Sullivan County had been trying to get a casino approved for 40 years, since long before the Concord closed, on the theory that casino money would rescue the region. In September 2025, the county's Industrial Development Agency authorized $585 million in bonds to buy the non-gaming parts of the resort, because the operator kept losing money. The casino that was supposed to save Sullivan County is now being kept alive on public credit. Where Kutsher stood, in Monticello, there is a 6-story yoga wellness resort called YAO1 Luxury Nature Cure. It opened in June 2018. The only original piece of Kutsher's still standing is the old nightclub. The front sign of the hotel was donated to the Sullivan County Historical Museum. Where the Nevele stood, in Ellenville, the 10-story tower is still there, decaying, sold in 2023 to a new investment group with plans for a hotel, condos, and townhomes. The Pine site is a burned lot. The Homowack Lodge site is a burned lot. Bungalow colonies across the county have been converted into ultra-Orthodox summer camps and yeshivas. Others have become Buddhist and Hindu retreat centers, enough of them that the region has picked up a second nickname. Some people now call it the Buddha Belt. The population of Sullivan County peaked in 1960 at 58,794. It is now about 80,000, but the shape of that population has changed. In the summer, Hasidic families from Brooklyn fill the bungalow colonies their grandparents' generation created. The Catskills Hatzalah, an Orthodox volunteer ambulance service, runs a fleet of 18 ambulances with 450 volunteers, mostly serving the 2-month summer surge. In July 2023, in Ellenville, in a neo-Georgian building put up in 1928 for the Home National Bank, the one bank in the region that had been willing to lend to the Jewish hoteliers when nobody else would, a museum opened. It is called the Borscht Belt Museum. Its permanent exhibits are still being built out. A separate project, run by a photographer named Marisa Scheinfeld, is installing 20 roadside historical markers across Sullivan and Ulster counties at the sites of the vanished hotels. There has not been one before. The Jarris hair tonic that funded the Concord is still on the shelves at any drugstore. It is sold now under the Clubman Pinard brand, still bright green, still a few dollars a bottle. The resort it built is a bulldozed field with a casino on it. The mountains are still there. The road is easy. The pools are gone.